The transition from external to internal mediation constitutes the supreme phase in the decline of the nobility. Revolution and immigration completed what reflection had begun. The nobleman, physically separated from his privileges, is henceforth forced to see them for what they really are, arbitrary. Stendhal clearly understood that the revolution could not destroy the nobility by taking away its privileges. But the nobility could destroy itself by desiring that of which it had been deprived by the bourgeoisie, and by devoting itself to the ignoble sentiments of internal mediation. To realize that the privilege is arbitrary and to still desire it is obviously the height of vanity. The noble thinks he is defending his nobility by fighting for its privileges against the other classes of a nation, but he only succeeds in ruining it. He desires to recuperate his wealth as a bourgeois might, and the envy of the bourgeoisie stimulates his desire and endows the pettiest of honorary trifles with immense value. Mediated by each other, henceforth the two classes will desire the same things in the same way. The Restoration Duke who regains his titles and fortune, thanks to the millions granted to the émigrés, is little more than a bourgeois, quote, who won in the lottery, end of quote. The nobleman constantly grows nearer the bourgeois, even in the hatred he feels for him. They are all ignoble, Stendhal writes somewhat strongly in his letter to Balzac, because they prize nobility. Gonna reread that. First, I'm going to read the paragraph before it. Stendhal never tires of describing the effects of la vanité triste on the customs and psychology of the French. The aristocrats are most hard hit. When one stops considering the serious results of the revolution, one of the first sights that strikes one's imagination is the present state of French society. I spent my youth among great lords who were very pleasant. Today they are old, disagreeable reactionaries. At first I thought their peevish humor was an unfortunate effect of age, so I made the acquaintance of their children who will inherit great wealth and noble titles. In fact, most of the privileges that men drawn together in society can confer on some among them. I found them sunk even deeper in despondency than their parents. The transition from external to internal mediation constitutes the supreme phase in the decline of nobility. Revolution and immigration completed what reflection had begun. The nobleman, physically separated from his privileges, is henceforth forced to see them for what they really are, arbitrary. Stendhal clearly understood that the revolution could not destroy the nobility by taking away its privileges. But the nobility could destroy itself by desiring that of which it had been deprived by the bourgeoisie and by devoting itself to the ignoble sentiments of internal mediation. To realize that the privilege is arbitrary and to still desire it is obviously the height of vanity. The noble thinks he is defending his nobility by fighting for its privileges against the other classes of a nation, but he only succeeds in ruining it. He desires to recuperate his wealth as a bourgeois might, and the envy of the bourgeoisie stimulates his desire and endows the pettiest of honorary trifles with immense value. Mediated by each other, henceforth the two classes will desire the same things in the same way. The Restoration Duke who regains his titles and fortune thanks to the millions granted to the émigrés is little more than a bourgeois, quote, who won in the lottery, end of quote. The nobleman constantly grows nearer the bourgeois, even in the hatred he feels for him. They are all ignoble, Stendhal writes somewhat strongly in his letter to Balzac, because they prize nobility. Only their elegant manners and politeness, the results of long training, give the nobles a little distinction over the bourgeoisie, and even this will soon disappear. Double mediation is a melting pot in which differences among classes and individuals gradually dissolve. It functions all the more efficiently because it does not even appear to affect diversity. In fact, the latter is even given a fresh, though deceptive, brilliance, the opposition of the same to the same, which flourishes everywhere, will hide itself for a long time to come behind traditional diversity, sheltering new conflicts behind the shadow of old ones and nourishing belief in the integral survival of the past. Under the Restoration, the nobility seems more alive than ever. Never have its privileges been more desired, nor its ancient families so eager to emphasize the barriers between themselves and the common people. Superficial observers are not aware that internal mediation is at work. They can only conceive uniformity as that of marbles in a bag or a sheep in a meadow. Let me repeat that. Superficial observers are not aware that internal mediation is at work. They can only conceive uniformity as that of marbles in a bag or sheep in a meadow. They do not recognize the modern tendency to identity and passionate divisions. They do not recognize the modern tendency to identity and passionate divisions, their own divisions, but the clash of symbols is loudest when they fit each other exactly. Let me repeat a few of those sentences. Under the Restoration, the nobility seems more alive than ever. Never have its privileges been more desired, nor its ancient families so eager to emphasize the barriers between themselves and the common people. Superficial observers are not aware that internal mediation is at work. They can only conceive uniformity as that of marbles in a bag or sheep in a meadow. They do not recognize the modern tendency to identity and passionate divisions, their own divisions, but the clash of symbols is loudest when they fit each other exactly. Because it is no longer distinct, the aristocracy tries to distinguish itself. And it succeeds marvelously, but that does not make it any more noble. It is a fact, for instance, that under the constitutional monarchy, the aristocracy is the stuffiest and most virtuous class in the nation. The frivolous and seductive nobleman of the Louis XV era has been replaced by the scowling and morose gentleman of the Restoration. This depressing character lives on his property, works hard, goes to bed early, and worst of all, even manages to economize. What is the significance of such austere morals? Is it really a return to the ancestral virtues? This is what we are told constantly in the bien pensant journals, but there is no need to believe it. This gloomy, sour-tempered, and totally negative kind of wisdom is typically bourgeois. The aristocracy is trying to prove to the others that it has earned its privileges. That is why it borrows its code of ethics from the class which is competing for those same privileges. Mediated by its bourgeois audience, the nobility copies the bourgeoisie without even realizing it. In Memories of a Tourist, Stendhal remarks sardonically that the revolution has bequeathed to the French aristocracy the customs of democratic Protestant Geneva. Thus, their very hatred of the bourgeoisie makes them middle class, and since mediation is reciprocal, we must expect to find a bourgeois gentleman to match the gentleman bourgeois. We must anticipate a bourgeois comedy which is symmetrical and inverse to the aristocratic comedy. The courtiers may copy Rousseau's Vicaire Savoyard in order to capture the good opinion of the bourgeois, but the bourgeois will also play at being great lords to impress the aristocrats. The type of the bourgeois imitator reaches the height of comic perfection in the character of Baron Neerwindle in Lamiel. Neerwind, the son of a general of the empire, slavishly and laboriously copies a synthetic model made up in equal parts of a roux of the Ancien regime and a dandy from across the channel. Neerwind leads a tedious and boring existence, but its very disorder He has organized methodically. He goes bankrupt conscientiously while keeping very exact accounts. He does it all to make people forget and to make himself forget that he is the grandson of a hatter from Périgueux. Double mediation flourishes everywhere. There is a set to partners in every figure of Stendhal's social ballet. Everything is reversed from its previous state. Stendhal's wit amuses us, but it seems a little too geometric to be true. It is important to note that Tocqueville, who was a completely humorless observer, makes assertions parallel to Stendhal's. In The Ancient Regime and the Revolution, for instance, we find the paradox of an aristocracy that by its opposition to the middle class begins to resemble it, and that adopts all the virtues of which the middle class is trying to rid itself. He writes, quote, "The most anti-democratic classes of the nation reveal most clearly to us the kind of morality it is reasonable to expect from a democracy," end of quote. When the aristocracy seems most alive is precisely when it is most dead. In an early edition of L'Emile Nurwend is called D'Aubigné. This imitative dandy belonged to the aristocracy, not to the parvenu middle class. He was a descendant of Madame de Maintenon. Otherwise, his conduct was exactly the same as in the last version of the novel. No doubt Stendhal chose the parvenu bourgeois, the commoner, to play the comedy of the nobility because he felt that the comic effect would be more apparent and reliable. But this does not mean he was mistaken in the first version. It illustrates an essential aspect of the Stendhalian truth. In that case, it was a nobleman by blood who played the comedy of nobility. With or without a coat of arms, one can desire nobility. Under Louis Philippe, only in the manner of Molière's bourgeois gentilhomme, one can only mime it. One can only mime it as passionately as M. Jourdain, but less naively. It is this kind of mimicry which Stendhal is trying to reveal to us. The complexity of the task and the fragmentation of the public, which are ultimately one and the same phenomenon, make the theater unsuited to carrying out this literary function. Comic theater died with the monarchy and gay vanity. A more flexible genre is needed to describe the infinite metamorphoses of Vérité Triste and reveal how void are its oppositions. This genre is the novel. Stendhal finally understood this after long years of effort and failure, which transformed his soul. He gave up the theater. But he never renounced his ambition of becoming a great comic writer. All novelistic works have a tendency to the comic, and Stendhal's are no exception. Flaubert excels himself in Bouvard et Pécuchet. Proust reaches his peak in the comic figure of the Baron Charles. Stendhal sums up and completes his work in the great comic scenes of L'Emile. The paradox of an aristocracy that becomes democratic through its very hatred of democracy is nowhere more striking than in political life. The tendency of the nobility to become bourgeois is clearly seen in its sympathy for the ultra party. The paradox of an aristocracy that becomes democratic through its very hatred of democracy is nowhere more striking than in political life. The tendency of the nobility to become bourgeois is clearly seen in its sympathy for the ultra party, a party devoted entirely to the defense of privilege. This party's conflict with Louis XVIII showed clearly that the monarchy was no longer the polar star of the nobility, but a political instrument in the hands of the noble party. This noble party is oriented not toward the king, but toward the rival bourgeoisie. The ultra ideology is merely the pure and simple reversal of revolutionary ideology. The theme throughout is reaction and reveals the negative slavery of internal mediation. Party rule is the natural political expression of this mediation. Party platforms do not bring about political opposition. Opposition brings about party platforms. To understand how ignoble ultracism is, it must be compared with a form of thought which was anterior to the revolution and which in its time convinced a whole section of the nobility, the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Stendhal believes that this philosophy is the only one possible for nobility that intends to remain noble in the exercise of its thought. When a genuine aristocrat, and there were still a few during the last century of the monarchy, enters the territory of thought, he does not abandon his native virtues. He remains spontaneous even in his reflection. Unlike the ultras, he does not expect the ideas he adopts to serve the interests of his class, any more than he would ask a challenger in a truly heroic era to present proof of nobility. The challenge alone would prove the nobility of the challenger in the eyes of someone with self-respect. In the realm of thought, rational evidence takes the place of the challenge. The nobleman accepts the challenge and judges everything in universal terms. He goes straight to the most general truths and applies them to all mankind. He does not acknowledge any exceptions, especially those from which he would profit. In Montesquieu and in the best of the enlightened nobles of the 18th century, there is no distinction between the aristocratic and the liberal mind. 18th century rationalism is noble even in 18th century rationalism is noble even in 18th century rationalism is noble even in its illusions. It puts its trust in human nature. It does not allow for the irrational in human relations, nor does it recognize metaphysical imitation, which frustrates the calculations of sound reflection. Montesquieu would have been less likable had he foreseen the vanité triste of the 19th century. Moreover, we soon realize that rationalism means the death of privilege. Truly noble reflection resigns itself to that death, just as the truly noble warrior is prepared to die on the battlefield. The nobility cannot reflect on itself and remain noble without destroying itself as a caste. And since the revolution forced the nobility to think about itself, its own extinction is the only choice left to it. The nobility can die nobly by the one and only political gesture worthy of it, the destruction of its own privileged existence. The night of August 4th, 1789, during the night the deputies of the aristocracy at the Revolutionary Assemblée Constituante voted the abolition of most feudal privileges. It dies meanly in a bourgeois fashion on the benches of some House of Lords, confronted by Vallenauds whom it ends up resembling through fighting with them over the spoils. This was the solution of the ultras. First came the nobility, then followed the noble class. Finally, only a noble party is left after the period when the two coincided. Spiritual and social nobility now tend to exclude each other. Henceforth, the incompatibility of privilege with greatness of soul is so radical that it is patent even in the attempts to conceal it. Take, for example, the justification of privilege given by Dr. Dupeyrier, the intellectual jack of all trades of the Nancy nobility. Quote, "A man is born a duke, a millionaire, and a peer of France. It is not for him to consider whether his position conforms with virtue, or with the general good, or with other fine ideas. His position is good, so he should do everything to maintain and improve it, or be despised generally as a coward and a fool." I'm going to reread just that quote. Quote, "A man is born a duke, a millionaire, and a peer of France. It is not for him to consider whether his position conforms with virtue, or with the general good, or with other fine ideas. His position is good, so he should do everything to maintain and improve it, or be despised generally as a coward and a fool." Dupeyrier would like to convince us that the 19th century nobleman is still living in a happy era, not yet affected by the look of the other, still enjoying his privileges spontaneously. Yet the lie is so flagrant that Dupeyrier does not phrase it directly. He uses a negative periphrasis that suggests without affirming, quote, "It is not for him to consider," end of quote, etc. Despite this oratorical precaution, the, quote, "look," end of quote, of the other is too obsessive, and Dupérier is forced to acknowledge it in the following sentence. But then he imagines a cynical point of honor to which this look forces the aristocrat to submit. If the privileged person does not hang on to his privilege, quote, "he will be despised as a coward or a fool," end of quote. Dupérier is once again lying. Aristocrats are neither innocent nor cynical. They are merely vanito. They want privilege merely as parvenus. This is the horrible truth which must be hidden at all cost. They are ignoble because they prize nobility. They are ignoble because they prize nobility. Since the revolution, no one can be privileged without knowing it. Stendhal's kind of hero is impossible in France. Stendhal likes to believe that he is still just possible in Italy, in that happy country, scarcely touched by the revolution. Reflection and concern with the other have not yet completely poisoned enjoyment of the world and of oneself. A truly heroic soul is still compatible with the privileged circumstances which allow him free play. Fabrice del Dongo can be spontaneous and generous in the midst of an injustice from which he benefits. First, we see Fabrice flying to the aid of an emperor who embodies the spirit of the revolution. A little later, we find our hero haughty, devout, and aristocratic in the Italy of his childhood. Fabrice does not think for a minute he is demeaning himself when he challenges a simple soldier of the glorious imperial army to a duel. Yet he speaks harshly to the servant who risks his life for him. Still later, despite his devotion, he does not hesitate to join in the Simeonic intrigues which will make him an archbishop of Parma. Fabrice is not a hypocrite, nor does he lack intelligence. He is merely lacking the historical foundations for the ability to reflect. The comparisons which a privileged young Frenchman would be forced to make never even enter his mind. The French will never recover the innocence of a Fabrice, for it is not possible to move backward in the order of the passions. Historic and psychic evolution are irreversible. Stendhal finds the Restoration revolting, but not because he sees in it naively a return to the Ancien regime. Such a return is unthinkable. Moreover, Louis XVIII Charter marks the first concrete step toward democracy since 1792. The current interpretation of the red and the black, therefore, is inadmissible. The Jacobin novel described in the handbooks of literature does not exist. If Stendhal were writing for all those bourgeois who are temporarily cut off from lucrative careers by the temporary triumph of an absolutist and feudal party, his would be a very clumsy work. Traditional interpretations go counter to the most basic tenets of the author and disregard the facts of the novel, among which is the brilliant career of Julien. One might object that this career is broken by the reactionary and clerical Congregation, a secret Catholic organization with great political influence. True, yet this same congregation a little later makes every effort to save the protégé of the Marquise de la Mole. Julien is not so much the victim of the ultras as of the wealthy and jealous bourgeois who will triumph in July 1830. Moreover, we should not look for any partisan lesson in Stendhal's masterpieces. To understand this novelist who is always talking politics, we must free ourselves of political ways of thinking. Julien has a brilliant career which he owes to Madame de la Mole. In his article on the Red and the Black, Stendhal describes the latter in these words, quote, "His character as nobleman was not formed by the revolution of 1794, end of quote." In other words, I guess it's Monsieur, I'm sorry, I don't know, like M period, this is the reader talking. M period could be Monsieur, could be Madame, I don't fucking know. Monsieur de la Mole retains some genuine nobility. He has not become middle class through hatred of the middle class. His freedom of thought has not made him a Democrat, but it prevents him from being a reactionary in the worst sense of the word. M. de la Mole does not depend exclusively on excommunications, negations, and refusals. Ultracism and the nobleman's reaction have not smothered all other sentiments in him. His wife and his friends judge men only by their birth, their fortune, and their political orthodoxy. And so would a Valenod in their place. But M. de la Mole is still capable of approving the rise of a talented commoner. He proves it with Julian Sorel. Only once does Stendhal find his character vulgar, when he loses his temper at the thought that his daughter, by marrying Julian, will never be a duchess. Julian owes his success to that element under the new regime which has most truly survived from the Ancien regime. This is a strange way for Stendhal to campaign against a return to the past. Even if the novelist had shown the failure of the numerous young people who did not have the good fortune to meet their Marquis de la Mole, his novel would still not have proved anything against the Ancien regime. In fact, it is the revolution which has increased the obstacles, since most people with status owe, quote, their character of noblemen, end of quote, i.e. their implacable ultracism, to the revolution. Must then the obstacle in the way of these young people be called democratic? Is not this an empty subtlety and even an untenable paradox? Surely it is only fair that the bourgeoisie should take over the control, since it is, quote, the most energetic and active class in the nation, end of quote. Is it not true that a little more democracy would smooth the way for the ambitious? I'm going to reread that. Must then the obstacle in the way of these young people be called democratic? Is not this an empty subtlety and even an untenable paradox? Surely it is only fair that the bourgeoisie should take over the controls, since it is the most energetic and active class in the nation. Is it not true that a little more democracy would smooth the way for the ambitious? It is true in any case the stupidity of the ultras makes their downfall inevitable. But Stendhal looks further. The political elimination of the noble party cannot reestablish harmony and satisfy the desires that have been awakened. The political conflict which rages under the constitutional monarchy is considered the sequel of a great historic drama, the last thunderclaps of a storm that is moving away. The revolutionaries suppose they must clear the ground and make a fresh start. Stendhal is telling them that they have already started. Ancient historic appearances hide a new structure of human relations. The party struggle is rooted not in past inequality, but in the present equality, no matter how imperfect it may be. The historical justification of the internal struggles is scarcely more than a pretext now. Put aside the pretext and the true cause will appear. Ultracism will disappear like liberalism. But internal mediation remains, and internal mediation will never be lacking in excuses for maintaining the division into rival camps. Following religious society, civic society has become schismatic. To look forward optimistically to the democratic future under the pretext that the ultras or their successors are destined to disappear from the political scene is once again to put the object before the mediator and desire before envy. This error can be compared to that of the chronic sufferer from jealousy, who always thinks his illness will be cured when the current rival is eliminated. The last century of French history has proved Stendhal right. The party struggle is the only stable element in contemporary instability. Principles no longer cause rivalry. It is a metaphysical rivalry which slips into contrary principles, like mollusks that nature has not provided with shells, and that install themselves in the first ones to come along, no matter what kind. Proof of this can be furnished by the pair Raynal-Valenod. M. de Raynal abandons ultracism before the 1827 elections. He has himself entered as a candidate on the Liberal ticket. Jean Prévost discovers in this sudden conversion proof that even Stendhal's secondary characters are capable of, quote, surprising, end of quote, the reader. Prévost, usually so perspicacious, in this point has fallen victim to the pernicious myths of the, quote, true to life, end of quote, and, quote, spontaneity, end of quote, which plague literary criticism.